The Rebbe in the Sikha now demonstrates how there is a halachic difference between Rashi's presentation of the Tahara procedure that it cannot be done at night to that of the Mishnah in their formulation that it may be done throughout the entire day. The halachic difference will be reflected in the period of Ben Hashmashot. To appreciate the concept of Ben Hashmashot, we will digress for a moment and look how time is measured, both in the civil calendar and its Jewish counterpart, as it pertains to halacha. To the population at large, time functions with approximations. In reality, it has been the subject of study in religion, philosophy, and science, and defining it in a way that it would be applicable to all fields has consistently eluded the scholars. However, in this day and age, in areas such as business, industry, sports, especially so, and in the sciences and the performing arts, all incorporate some notion of time into their respective measuring systems. In the day-to-day humdrum of life, the smallest measure of time is the second. 1 minute is 60 of those seconds. 1 hour is 60 minutes, and 1 day is 24 hours. A week is a set of 7 days. A month is either 30 days or 31 days. And finally, the Gregorian year is a period of 12 of those months. There's also a decade, 10 years, and a century. The base unit for all these periods is the second, which can be measured by the humble watch. In this day and age, there is a need to quantify events in segments that are far smaller than a second. We hear of a millisecond, which can be divided, subdivided, and further subdivided 10 times. The most accurate time measurement that we have is the atomic clock that measures times to a zeptosecond, to the point where the internet can inform me that my computer clock is 3.8 seconds behind the real time and has an accuracy of 0.005 seconds. To most people, the second is the smallest unit of time. In the world of physics, it is a Planck time unit, which is the amount of time that light takes to travel 1 Planck length. Relative to today, biblical time is far less sophisticated, although many mitzvot are limited to a particular time of the year. In Jewish law, the calendar day is defined as running from evening to evening. However, Jewish law requires that certain activities be undertaken during the day or at certain times during the night. And to the average person, the Yom began at sunrise and ended at sunset, and Laila began at sunset and ended at sunrise. It could be argued that throughout the Torah Sheba'al Peh period up until the Common Era, time restraints would have functioned in a fairly approximate milieu. And in fact, paralleling the evolution of early Roman law, the Tanaim who lived during that period attempted to quantify the various minhagim that evolved in the Torah Sheba'al Peh system by grounding the minhagim of the day by a Torah text statement. This ultimately evolved in the formation of the Mishnah. The opening Mishnah, penned by Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, dealt with the mitzvah of Kriyat Shema, and however one defines what constitutes the obligation to recite the Shema, based upon the words V'dibarta bam, them, the very same pasuk concludes that this should be done b'shiftecha bevitecha v'lechtecha v'derech uv'shachbecha uv'kumecha. There have always been and will always continue to be two polar opposites for the interpretation of any text. With respect to b'shachbecha uv'kumecha, one can adopt a literalist interpretation, just as b'shiftecha bevitecha uv'lechtecha v'derech implies that one could or should fulfill this obligation either at home or on a journey. So too, the literalist would interpret the word ubeshachbacha, uvakumecha, as lying down and standing up, or lying down or standing. The first option is an obligation to recite the Shema twice, once standing up, the other lying down. The second obligation would mandate only a single recitation, for which you would have two options, either standing or lying. The early Tanaim took a different approach, and that was the words uveshachbacha uvakumecha mandate that the mitzvah of a dibarta bam should take place twice each day, that the words b'shachbacha uvakumecha provided the time frame as to when the mitzvah of Kriyat Shema was to be fulfilled. It was in the Mishnah that Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi quantified this mitzvah, and in the opening Mishnah to Brachot, he provides us with three viewpoints The first, from Rabbi Eliezer, that the latest time for the fulfillment of this mitzvah is the end of the 4th hour, and we will shortly talk about hours. The Chachamim maintain that one has the option to recite the Shema until midnight, and the view of Rabban Gamliel is that the mitzvah can be fulfilled at any time throughout the night until daybreak. In quantifying the time of Ubeshach Bacha, the Tanaim also took it out of the hands of the individual and used the community as the guide for defining this word. In other words, the obligation is not when one decides to go to sleep that the mitzvah of Kriyat Shema becomes active, but when the community at large begins the preparations for sleep, which in the days of pre-electricity would begin when it became dark. And similarly with the definition for the word uvakumecha, when people rise up from their sleep, usually at or around daybreak. A second example where time plays a role in the fulfillment of Torah obligation relates to the mitzvah of Biur Chametz, the removal and the destruction of chametz, along with the prohibition against the consumption of chametz. There are a number of references in the Torah that point to this prohibition with nuanced changes from one to the other. One of the references comes from Shemot 12:15, which is the primary source for adding an extra half day of prohibition from the consumption, the ownership, and the benefits one may have from chametz. What on the surface appears to be a rather straightforward statement, that Bayom Harishon Tashpitu Seor Mibateichem, on the first day you are to tashpitu any seor from your property. Seor and chametz very often are used interchangeably in the Torah text and refers to products that are a catalyst and or an end product of items that have been fermented with yeast, specifically grain yeast. Tashpitu with a shurish of shin bet taf, to cease, to stop, as in Shabbat, refers to the method one uses to destroy and or remove ownership from one's chametz. And the most puzzling drash emanates from the interpretation of the word Bayom Harishon, which normally would refer to the first day of Pesach, but in reality refers to the day before the onset of Chag HaPesach, Nisan the 14th. In other words, sometime during the 14th day of Nisan, the seor chametz must be removed, destroyed from one's homes. What happened before the Tanaic period is unclear. We make assumption that there may have been various minhagim, as each community interpreted the Bayom Harishon as they saw fit, or conversely, there may have been a Masorah tracing itself back to Har Sinai that the Bayom Harishon referred to the Nisan the 14th. Either way, the term was quantified in the Mishnah that as of midday Nisan the 14th, there is a Torah prohibition against the consumption of chametz seor. However, on account of the fact that there was no centralized system of determining the beginning of Zman Isur, a 1-hour buffer was inserted in which time the consumption of chametz seor would have been in violation of a rabbinical decree. How much of a buffer is an issue of contention between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Meir maintained that a single-hour buffer was adequate, whereas Rabbi Yehuda maintained that with regard to consumption, for which the violation is much more severe in terms of the punishment recorded in the Torah, a 2-hour buffer was required, which is the prevailing custom to this very day. We will now look into the issue of the halachic hour, which by its very nature cannot be the hour as we measure it, a time period of 60 minutes.